Do 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 do. Howdy. So it looks like it's my turn to speak. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So feminism today is concerned with a wide variety of issues, including those which impact men, women, and people of color. It's concerned with the many ways in which the patriarchal society we live in causes problems for them. Feminism is an attempt to improve our culture by addressing the ultimate root cause of these issues, a fundamental societal inequality intrinsic to a patriarchal system like ours. I have more to say on this, but it's kind of a broad issue, and I can't even imagine which angle you could possibly attack it from. So I'm
Okay, well, I appreciate you passing it over so quickly. I'd like to go ahead and state the fact that we don't live in a patriarchy. So the first points you were addressing had to do with that. So I want to pass back the mic because we don't live in a patriarchy, and there's no study that backs that up. There's nobody that has any kind of credibility in our society that actually thinks that we live in a patriarchy. So I want to pass that back to you so you can at least acknowledge that point, and then we can.
okay.
A patriarchy. If you don't know what a patriarchy is, then I don't know why you're debating.
No, my question is, you're saying that we don't live in a patriarchy with such certainty, and I'm curious as to like, what do you mean when you say it like so certainly? Like, well, what do you mean when you say the word patriarchy?
Okay, if I'm going to have to define what a patriarchy is, I would just go with the definition that it's a society that rules in order to benefit men at the expense of women. Essentially, it's a society that is run by men for men and at the expense of women, usually. I think you could make that argument in Saudi Arabia. If you want to look at what a real patriarchy would look like, then look at Saudi Arabia, where when they have women's rights conferences, there aren't a single woman there. So I think that Saudi Arabia would be a.
I think that's a really good example. And I would amend your definition though. I think that a patriarchal society is one in which ultimately men lead, and it's kind of a male dominant culture. But I don't agree that a patriarchal society benefits men. I think that both men and women are harmed by patriarchal society. For example, I think, if we're talking about, say you're a male victim of domestic violence, right? Like, society is going to kind of look down on that and mistreat it and not kind of take it seriously. And the reason they aren't going to take it seriously is because in the society we live in, men are viewed as so much above women and women as so much weaker that the idea that a woman could harm a man in that way is laughable. It's impossible. It's ridiculous. And this is an example of a patriarchal system because the fundamental assumption is that women are less than men. And that fundamental assumption leads to conclusions which are harmful.
If we live in a society that thinks women are less than men, why is it that since around 1910 or so, women's average life expectancy has increased by several years, whereas men's has stayed about the same, and we've actually had a greater gap in the rate at which men die and then the rate at which women die? Women's specific like health research from like breast cancer and other things that specifically affect women get way, way more funding in our society than things like colon cancer, which affect men, that kill an equal number of men. Men in our society commit suicide more. Men in our society die from every preventable disease more. If we live in a society that thinks of women as less than men, even in the days when you could have argued that there was more sexism, I guess, in like, let's say the 40s or something, it was still women and children first. If there was a fire, if there was an accident, if there was a boat sinking, it was women and children first because women and children are what's valued in our society. Men have no value in our society, and it's why they are not cared about when things happen. It's why domestic violence isn't a serious issue for men. It's not because the idea of a woman hurting a man is so insane. It's the idea that men need to be protected because, as I've said, men are used to being disposable. And there's a lot of great different articles and videos. Karen Strawn, the Girl Writes What, she has a great video on the disposability of men. Warren Farrell talks a lot about it. I suggest anybody who's watching and is interested, check out the Myth of Male Power. by Warren Farrell. But to say that we live in a patriarchy, or that it's men's fault, essentially, because that's what you're saying. If you're saying that we live in a society that's run by men, and yet when you look at it, men suffer in every single way, at least in the United States, more than women. I can't think of a single issue that isn't gender specific that women face more than men. And I'd like to hear, again, from the health standpoint, from there being no domestic violence support for men, even though women initiate it more than men do. I'm curious as to how you can think that we live in a world that is, at least not in a world, I guess you'd say in a country that isn't targeted directly towards women.
According to the Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence, government source, men make up 97% of domestic abusers. By this, the government source means coercive, controlling violence. Women only start to gain ground when you include responsive or defensive violence. So I'm wondering what source you have which supersedes these studies done by, again, the Office of the Prevention of Domestic Violence that leads you to believe that most of these are women and
Sorry about that. Before I can address that, I'm going to look that up right now. But while I'm looking that up, I want you to address all my other points about why women live longer, why women get more health, women get more money for their health issues, why women get any kind of treatment when it comes to any of their issues, why we care about anything if we live in a society that essentially is just there to take advantage of women for being women. Again, even if that isn't your belief, why do we live in a society that is run by men, essentially for men, and yet men are losing? Men are dying more. Men are committing suicide more. Men are losing in the courts when it comes to divorce rates. I can't think of a thing, again, that isn't gender specific to women, that women face more than men. From preventable disease to suicide to homelessness to everything, men suffer more than women do. So I really want to understand where your perspective is that we live in a society that women, because you have 2 minutes more than me, so I'd like to hear, what.
Well, definitely, and I want to point out to you that I gave you an example of something that women suffer from more than men in the form of domestic violence, because according to the office I just said, 97% of the initiators of domestic abuse are men. However, you pointed out that men are dying at higher rates. I want to point out to you that a statistic, and I'll have to dig up this study, and I'll post it in the comments. All studies I'm posting, I have a set of links, and I will post them in the comments after the debate so that we can review them and continue this conversation at a later date, hopefully. Being in a marriage with a woman raises the life expectancy of a man. And one of the reasons for that is that, let me find the study. Anyways, I don't have time to find the study. Male life expectancy raises when he becomes married to a woman. And whereas a woman life expectancy, it varies depending on the study, but it will go down or flatline when she stays with a man. Like, the impact of a woman in the life of a man has a positive impact on the life expectancy. And I think that you dismissing societal assertions on the basis of something that may very well simply be biological, like maybe women are simply, maybe they just do live longer. As a species, it makes sense biologically, evolutionarily, for a species to have women which live longer, because it takes a woman 9 months to create a baby, whereas a man can repopulate a species in a few months if he wants. If, it works really hard. You know what I mean? So, however, I also want to talk about suicide rates, because I think that's really important. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. However, we live in a society where men are taught to suppress their emotions, to not seek help, right? And because we live in that kind of a society, men, rather than seeking the kind of help that they need, end up suppressing it until they end up in a suicidal state. And I think that is ultimately rooted in the patriarchy. When a man is taught to be stoic, and when a man is taught that he can't express his emotions, that there's nowhere for him to turn to, that the medical system won't provide for him because he has to be strong, whereas women are weak. We help women because they're weak. Men need to toughen up because they're strong. That is the patriarchal society and its message to the people. And it hurts men and it hurts women, and it sends men to the grave by suicide, and it sends women, honestly to the doctor more because they're more willing to accept that they're weak. But all of these things are encompassed in patriarchal.
Okay, well, that's an impressive amount of victim blaming there against men. Essentially, you're saying that it's men's own fault that they don't have attention to their issues. You're saying that a woman, just by being in a relationship with a man, is essentially putting her life on the line or giving herself more issues to face down the road. And about, I think you were saying that a woman being in a man's life, like it extends his life expectancy. Well, so does a dog. Studies have shown that having a dog extends your life. That doesn't mean that is something that you absolutely have to have, although I think human relationships are extremely important for people to have. As far as the violence statistics, I can find some other ones later on in this discussion, but I think the point that really needs to be made is that over 80% of domestic violence arrests are against men, and then when men are called, when police show up and men are there, about 80% of the time it ends up in arrest, whereas about 13% of the time it ends up in arrest for women. Women just do not get arrested for domestic violence, and those are on my last debate. I'll link those again. On February, the CDC found that over their lifetime, 44% of lesbians have been physically assaulted by a partner, more than 2/3 of them, and only by women. And that's compared to 35% of straight women, 26% of gay men. So actually, if you're a woman in a woman-on-woman relationship, you're more likely to be assaulted than if you're in a straight relationship. And if you're in a gay relationship, you're even less likely than you're to be assaulted. So if you want to look at as far as the gender dynamic between relationships, every study that has come out that has been objective about lesbian relationships have shown that they are the most violent relationships that you can be in. So you don't need to be a man to be violent, and I think that it's really appalling that people use that as some kind of excuse. As far as suicide, I'm sorry, I almost forgot the rest of my point about the violence. Go ahead and I'm going to get these books or these quotes directly out of The Myth of Male Power. These are going to be from page 214. For every woman who is murdered, 3 men are murdered. With the exception of rape, the more violent the crime, the more likely the victim is to be a man. Actually, we now know that men face rape a lot more than women, if you include like institutionalized rape, like in prisons and stuff. Males are the primary victims of all violent crimes except rape. These violent crimes, excluding rape, have increased by 36%. Rape, the one violent crime in which females are the primary victim, even though that's actually not true anymore and hasn't been true for probably some time, has decreased by 80% in the last 30 years. Forcible rape constitutes less than 6% of all violent crimes. Let me repeat that. Forcible rape constitutes less than 6%. Violent crimes of which men are the primary victims constitute the remaining 94%. So, yeah, I mean, I guess if you think that, living in a society where 94% of the violence is against one gender and it's not women and that women are oppressed, I just don't see it in the statistics.
Hey, so a few things I want to talk about. The first is, of course, men are more victimized by violence. When you have a culture that raises men under the "you don't hit women," right? Women are treated like children. They're weaker. To hit a child is despicable. To hit a woman is despicable. To hit a man, to kill a man, to punch a man, well, did he deserve it? The difference is respect. The violence comes from respect. However, your rape statistic is ridiculous. The idea that men are victims of rape, if you include prison statistics, is a rumor that has its ultimate origin in the Daily Mail, which is a tabloid. About 3% of American men have experienced rape in their lifetime, which is, 1 out of every 10 rape victims are male. 1 out of every 10. The prison study, which included that men are raped more than women, includes not only rape, but any kind of unwanted sexual touching. So by including it in a rape thing, you are right off the bat, not telling the truth. In total, the survey found 57,900 cases of sexual victimization. If all of those are rapes, which is which would require literally every case of sexual victimization in prison to go straight to rape, it still doesn't even things out because the number of female victims is over 164,000 per year and the number of male victims is under 40,000. And these numbers are according to the Department of Justice, not some anti-feminist book that you have lying on your desk. Including prison numbers in the actual studies, women still outrape men. This is simply not a true statement. And the Daily Mail's decision to publish it and people like yours decision to believe it explains why they're a tabloid and why you lack, credibility.
Actually, I don't lack credibility because I'm citing sources. And if you don't like that source, then I'd like to see you refute it instead of just saying you don't like it. But I'd like to make the point that it's really annoying when you constantly blame men for their own issues. And when you say that the reason that women aren't, hit is because they're respected, then you're kind of making my point for me that yes, women in our society are respected much more than men. And it's the reason we don't hit them. It's the reason that when they're divorced, even if it was their fault, they get the house. I could go on and on about how our society is genocentric and we focus on women, from women's issues to having a White House women's and girls panel where we don't have anything for men. I guess I'm failing to understand how you got to your worldview. And I wanted to go back to, you were talking about my anti-feminist book. If you know anything about Warren Farrell, he was a feminist before you were born. And he was head of the National Women's Organization for a while as well. And since this entire debate is about whether or not feminism is still relevant and needed in our society, I want to just go ahead and say that feminism was a racist movement at the very beginning. They stepped on black people in order to get the right to vote. The suffragettes basically did everything they could to say that black people were less than scum so that they could get the vote. So if we want to go back to the roots of feminism, it starts off very racist and very classist. It hasn't changed much, but even when somebody says, well, white feminism is much different, I don't like white feminism, that's still getting into semantics. The problem is the fact that we live in a society that doesn't address men's issues. Men commit suicide more. I've already said all the facts about how men die more, men lose custody of children more. I mean, anything that you can name about women suffering that isn't gender specific, men suffer more and in much, much greater numbers. Rape, I will just go ahead and concede the point to you just for the sake of this debate. Let's just say you're right. Let's just say you're right. Let's just say that less than 6% of crimes in our country are affecting women. And then the other 94% or 94+% are affecting men. I still don't see the world you see, because the more violent a crime is, the more likely the victim is to be a man. And I am just failing to understand what world you live in where you think that simply because, actually, I'm still not understanding. I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic back to you because you haven't answered so many of my different questions and statements, and I just feel like I'm going in circles, and you're kind of just saying that this is men's fault and we live in a patriarchy, and these are all assumptions that you're making. There's no evidence, again, that we live in a patriarchy. I'd like you to provide one credible source that says we live in a patriarchy before you use the term patriarchy to defend anything, because you can't defend any of your arguments with we live in a patriarchy.
Okay, so first off, if patriarchy is ruled by men, 90% of current congressional lawmakers are male. 100% of historical presidents have been male. And you're upset about an all-female panel, which I think is ridiculous. I also think it's ridiculous that you're sitting here like, oh, well, you haven't said anything, and telling me like, oh, I should provide statistics and sources. Immediately before you said that, I did provide a source. It was the Department of Justice, with numbers that disprove your anti-feminist book. Regardless of the author's history, he doesn't have more credibility than the Department of Justice. And when I say, when I talk about respect, I meant men are more respected than women. Your idea that, oh, well, we don't hit women because they're more respected, that argument also applies to children. We don't respect 4-year-olds more than 30-year-olds. That's not why we don't hit 4-year-olds. That's not why it's worse to hit 4-year-olds. It's worse to hit 4-year-olds because they're weaker, just like women are perceived as weaker. And if a 4-year-old hits a 30-year-old, it's not a terrible thing. We don't take the 30-year-old seriously when he complains. We laugh at him when he goes to the police because it's a 4-year-old. You couldn't defend yourself against a 4-year-old. And that's the attitude society has towards women. That's why there's more violence against men. That's why complaints of violence against men, including domestic abuse, aren't taken as seriously. It's sick and it's disgusting. And I have a huge problem with the way that the patriarchy is oppressing men. And me talking about the patriarchy is not me like blaming men. It's not me blaming the victims. I have a lot of heart for the victims. I have a big problem with the way they've been victimized. But I recognize that the system that is victimizing them is patriarchal. It's run almost entirely top to bottom by men. Women have been oppressed in every society all over the world throughout almost all of human history. Like, the small number of rights that have given them enough traction for you to even be able to begin to make the claims that you're making are within the last 40 years, within the last 100 years step forward. You know what I mean? And like, you know, just this whole idea is ridiculous. And yeah, so I'm going to pass the mic to you and wait for you to tell me again that after I've reminded you that I cited the Department of Justice, for you to say, well, you should go ahead and cite some sources. I'm excited.
You haven't said anything yet. I asked you to go ahead and say, if you're going to continue to use the term patriarchy to defend your arguments, I told you to define a patriarchy and present evidence for it, which you haven't been able to do because we don't live in a patriarchy. And saying that, well, a certain number of people in our government are men does not make it a patriarchy, okay? Just because elected officials are a certain gender, they're elected officials. That doesn't make our government a patriarchy. And in fact, I believe it was a study from Harvard came out to show that we live in an oligarchy. So I have studies to back up what I believe, that we live in an oligarchy. I'd like to hear a single study that says that we live in a patriarchy that's from anything resembling something of any kind of objective merit from an educational institution. And I'm hearing from somebody that, you know, it is a scientific fact that men are stronger than women. But the reason you don't hit a 4-year-old is because of, yes, respect. You need to respect everyone. Just because they're a child doesn't mean you can't respect them. And if you're not hitting a 4-year-old just because they're weaker than you, then you are morally deficient. If that's your excuse for not hitting children, then you are morally deficient, my friend. It is not because they are seen as weaker. It is because it is seen as morally wrong, just like it's morally wrong to hit a woman, whereas it is seen as morally gray and kind of just whatever to hit a man, because we encourage it in our society that men are disposable. And people like yourself victim blame everybody who's a man, essentially saying that, well, if you think that it's, you know, this is an issue, then you need to blame the men in charge because it's their fault. So again, I want you to define a patriarchy with some kind of thing resembling evidence before you continue to base up your claims on these. And I'd like you to address the fact that men die earlier, they commit suicide more, they get less funding for health and research, they don't get their children in courts. Now, if the government is so full of these men, then how come in the court systems that are run by these men, the men don't get anything? How come it's almost every single time a man is in court, in divorce court, the woman gets everything? Is that because we don't respect?
Hey, so I'm going to go ahead and start by defining patriarchy. This is according to the dictionary. A system of society or government in which men hold the power and women are largely excluded from it. 100% of the executive branch, the overwhelming majority of the historical judicial branch, and 90% of the legislative branch is holding the power, with women being largely excluded from it. And the whole we're not a patriarchy, we're an oligarchy thing is so, like, do you know what those words mean? Because when folks talk about a patriarchy, they're talking about a formal system of governance. They're talking about the fact that people who hold the power are generally men. And the system is set up in a way which favors men. You know, as I just said, here's the definition again. A system or society in which men hold the power and women are largely excluded from it. An oligarchy is rule by a group, okay, a group of people. If all of those people are men, then it is a patriarchy and an oligarchy. See, oligarchy is a system for how the government is set up in terms of how many people do the ruling and the structure in which they rule. Patriarchy, according to the dictionary, is a word which refers to the power held by men in a society. If men hold the power and women are excluded from it, it's a patriarchy. If it is ruled by a group of people, it is an oligarchy. And those things don't contradict. So when you use that study, you should look up what the words mean. That's my advice for you. So when you talked about, you kind of did this emotional appeal kind of silly thing when you talked about hitting the children. And you said, it's considered morally deplorable to hit children. It's considered morally deplorable to hit women, but it's not considered morally deplorable to hit men. And then you went back to the suicide statistics. And it feels like your whole argument is, well, men have it bad, where there are ways in which men are discriminated against. But then I explained how those things are explainable by the patriarchal system in which we live in. And instead of just addressing that, you just repeat the statistics. You say, well, it's okay to hit a man. Yes, in the modern society we live in, disgustingly, unacceptably, it is considered okay for someone to strike a man, and that's not okay. It's considered morally gray, and that's not okay. However, in the society we live in, it's considered absolutely not okay, totally morally reprehensible to hit a child. And in the same way, it is considered morally reprehensible for a man to strike a woman. The problem is that women are not viewed as equals. The problem is punching down. Society has an issue in which punching down is viewed as morally reprehensible, and violence between equals depends on who started it. You know what I mean? And that is fundamentally a childization, a lack of respect for women. And all these other things you're mentioning are ultimately like women get the children because they're assumed to be homemakers. Men are mistreated in these systems because they are viewed as the aggressor. They're viewed as the aggressor because they're viewed as being stronger. They're viewed as being stronger because the patriarchal system we live in views as women as being weaker and less. And so now that I've answered all your questions, I'm ready.
You haven't answered my questions. In fact, you're incredibly good at tiptoeing around them. I asked you to not define a patriarchy. Any moron can pull up a dictionary and read a definition of a word. I was asking you to find a study that says that we live in a patriarchy, or find a shred of evidence saying we live in a patriarchy beyond your own shallow validation from your personal experiences, because that's all you've done so far. When you've talked about the reason that men commit suicide or the reason that men are hit, these are all things that you've based on your own beliefs about us living in a patriarchy, which, as you said by your own definition, a patriarchy is a society in which is run by men and largely excludes women. Our government does not largely exclude women. In fact, one of the last two major candidates to run for president was, you know what, a woman. Yeah, it was a woman, and she got the popular vote. So I don't know, again, what world you live in where you think women aren't equal and yet they can run for any office that a man can run for, and they're given any position a man can have. I don't understand what equality is when it's not equality. Are you talking about superiority, or are you talking about actual equality, like some kind of delusional idea that we can live in a world where 50% of our government is men and 50% is women? Because that's not a world that we can actually realistically live in. Like, that kind of equality is unattainable. Should a person who can only carry one brick and a wheelbarrow be paid the same as somebody who can carry two? I'd like to hear the answer to that question, but I'd really like you to hear, I'd really like to hear you tell me what evidence you have that we live in a patriarchy, because almost this entire debate, you have validated your points with your own beliefs and your own opinions, not facts. These are all your own opinions and your own ideas about how our society views women and how our society views men. And so I'd like to hear you say something resembling some facts instead of these opinions that you continue to have. You explained that men have it worse. Yeah, men do have it worse in our society. Or you said that men have some things worse. Men have it worse objectively in every single way except gender-specific things. So I'd really like to hear how you think women have it so bad and how they're not equal in our society. Name one thing women don't have.
So you keep repeating you can't think of one thing, which I find shocking, because in the last less than 40 minutes, I've demonstrated that both rape and domestic violence are things that women have worse than men. I find myself, totally baffled by this, especially because you said you didn't say to define a patriarchy, but yes, you did. And then you said I didn't support it, but I did, because I said excluded. The definition says excluded, and you seem to think I make legally or constitutionally excluded. The fact of the matter is, we live in a country where a person, for the first time in history, a woman ran as a major party candidate. And by the way, one after well over 200 years, making it to nomination of a major party is not, equality, okay? But after finally we reached that point, she was beaten in a slew of gender-based attacks from the right by a man who openly on tape confessed to sexual assault, by a man who, bullied one of his female assistants until she had an eating disorder, by a man who, said about women, you have to treat them like fecal matter. We're going to keep the PG. This last election was a victory by the patriarchy over women. And I think anyone who watched it with an open mind would agree. But I just find this whole thing I cite statistics, I cite definitions per your request. I explain, what a patriarchy means and how rule by overwhelmingly men, which excludes women societally, not legally, societally, women aren't 10% of the legislators because they're intrinsically worse, you know? And if 50 years ago women were unequal, and surely no sane person, if no sane person, I assume, I don't know whether or not you would argue, but I know no sane person would argue that sexism didn't exist 50 years ago. If it did, if 5 years ago we became truly gender equal in our societal attitudes, then 5 years ago we had a situation in which business and politics were infiltrated by men who had 40 years of experience and women who were just starting. Okay, and because of that imbalance, there is necessarily going, like, it's a slow scale upward, you know, and you know, part of that slow scale upward is acclimating women, you know, helping them get in spite of their, you know, women have finally achieved legal rights in this country, but society still excludes them. It still attacks them with gender-based attacks. It still values them based on their appearance. And when a woman finally made it to the point where she might have been a top seat, she was beaten by a man who, you know, confessed to sexual assault. And when you say she won the popular vote isn't the government. So we're talking about whether we live in a patriarchy.
And you still have yet to actually provide any evidence that we live in a patriarchy beyond saying the definition. By your logic, if there's not enough Asian Americans in our government, then we live in a society that is prejudiced against Asian Americans. If there's not enough Native Americans in our government, then same thing. Essentially, by your logic, any group that isn't represented enough, we are oppressing, or they are essentially, and that's just not that one does not proceed to the other. All right, that's called a non sequitur. I'd like to address. You've made so many just fake bullshit claims that it's hard for me to address them all. You said that Trump admitting to sexual assault on camera, that's total bullshit. He said that women let you touch them by the pussy. Women let you grab them by the pussy. He said they let you do that. How is it sexual assault when somebody says they let you do this? So Dave Chappelle made that point, and he got a lot of shit for it. You said gender-based attacks on Clinton. None of the stuff was gender-based. She was just a horrible politician. She was a narcissist, and she was a sociopath, and she stayed married to somebody who raped women. And the fact that you sound like you might be for her at all is a pretty amazing thing to me. The fact that you say that Trump's campaign was a victory for the patriarchy. Did you know that Trump's campaign was headed by a woman, Kellyanne Conway, who for the first time in our history was the first woman to successfully run a campaign? Wow, it's so crazy that a woman helped the patriarchy win. I guess it's all that internalized misogyny or something, because all of these ad hominems that you keep on throwing out, like against Trump, saying these things that aren't true, and to say that we exclude women societally, no, these women are choosing the wrong things. Women are not going into government. Women are going into liberal arts, and women are going into a lot of degrees that don't pay as well. But we still live in a society where women are making more of every single degree, or they're graduating with more of every single degree than men. So women are graduating with more bachelor's degrees, more associate's degrees, more doctorate's degrees, and more master's degrees. Every single degree women are graduating more than men with. So our schools definitely aren't prejudicing women at all. In fact, women have way more support in our schools. Since I don't have much time left, I wanted to quote some feminists, since that's what this conversation was supposed to be about. I'd like to quote some feminists that are pretty famous feminists. Andrea Dworkin: under patriarchy, no woman is safe to live her life or to love or to mother children. Under patriarchy, every woman is a victim, past, present, and future. Under patriarchy, every woman's daughter is a victim, past, present, and future. Under patriarchy, every woman's son is her potential betrayer and also the inevitable rapist or exploiter of another woman. Feminism sees men as less than dirt. AIDS education will not get very far until young men are taught how not to rape young women and how to criticize and trust consent, and until young women are supported in the way they need to be, refining their desires. That's Naomi Wolf. Marilyn French said all men are rapists, and that's all they are. And a suffragette from the 1900s said, we are, as a sex, infinitely superior to men. So these are just a few quotes from very famous and very influential feminists. I'm not even choosing bloggers and all the vitriolic misandry out there, because it's just too much to cover. And honestly, all of the misinformation you provided is so hard for me to dissect in this short period of time. That's why I normally don't have this much time left. Normally, my opponent is the one with all the time left. But since you haven't actually addressed any of my points, and I continue to try to get you to give me any evidence that we live in a patriarchy, all you've done is try to make arguments from personal experience, and I'm sorry, but those just don't hold any water. So please try and make some objective claims, because all you've done so far is quote something about rape and about domestic violence, both of which.
Okay, so, you know, man, so much ridiculousness, I don't know where to start. So your arguments that equality exists is that for the first time, you're like, well, wow, you know, for the first time in 2016, a woman ran a successful campaign. A woman doing something for the first time in United States history, for the first time this year, is not an argument for equality. The idea that a woman almost had a chance at the top spot in our government for the first time in history this year is not an argument that we've reached equality. You know what I mean? That like all of your arguments against the idea that we live in a patriarchal society are evidences for a patriarchal society, and I've demonstrated that we live in a patriarchal society because I quoted what the definition was, and then I explained, you know, if we live in a society where men hold the power and women are excluded from the power, like 100% of all presidents, like 90% of the Congress, and like, hang on, a percentage male Supreme Court justices. I'm just going to assume it's real low because that's how this is going. And if it's not, if you Google this, if anyone Googles this and find that more than 15% of historical Supreme Court justices have been women, you should vote against me. Like, I'm willing to stake my whole thing on the bet that it's not more than 15%. So, more points. When a boss, a power figure, walks up to a woman and without her consent seizes her vagina and she passively allows it to happen, that's sexual assault. Whether something is sexual assault isn't determined by after the fact how they react, A. B, if you have any female friends, which I suspect you don't, my assumption is that they have learned by now to stay away from you. You should walk up to them and ask, you know, she has probably, whoever you're talking to, been a victim of sexual assault, and she'll probably tell you when it happened, she froze up. That's what they do. They freeze up because they're scared, because these people were bigger than them and usually hold more power than them, as in Trump's case. You know what I mean? But like, numerous women came forward. He said he did it. He said he did it. And then these women who supposedly let it happen came forward and said, this was sexual assault. You know what I mean? And like, just... he confessed to sexual assault on tape. That's just what happened.
You just personally attacked me. I have 5 seconds left. I don't know.
Okay, cool. Well, so I also want to point out that your whole argument, you know, for a while you were talking about, you know, listing a handful of cherry-picked feminists, like, oh, look at these horrible things they're saying. Like, I could cherry pick a handful of Trump supporters and say, you know, like, look at what they're saying, and you'd say it was BS. You know what I mean? And I do think that'd be BS. It's different when Trump confesses to sexual assault on camera. But when you know, numerous Trump supporters come forward and say these terrible things, you'd say you can't cherry pick these people and use it as an argument against a movement. And you'd be absolutely right. It's BS. It's ridiculous. It's fallacious. You're clearly a person who is skated by on emotional appeals and on, you know, statistics from, you know, anti